More than most stars of classic cinema, Audrey Hepburn seems to have endured in the popular consciousness. Google her name and you'll find hundreds of articles recently written about her wardrobe. Check Etsy and you'll find pages upon pages of fan art and prints. Walk around New York City and you'll probably see some Breakfast at Tiffany's references at some of those street art vendors. Audrey Hepburn is everywhere, or at least her image is. Now, maybe I'm a little bit very cynical, and I suspect that the details of Audrey Hepburn's career and life have become lost in the power of her image. So in this video, we're going back to the very beginning of her career to think about how her debut performance in Roman Holiday represents not only the genesis of her stardom, but also the qualities that have made her persona last. We'll talk about the Oscar race of 1953, how the press perceived this brand new star, and the parts of Audrey's story that are often overlooked. Born in Belgium, raised in England, and living in the Netherlands, Audrey Hepburn dreamed of becoming a dancer. Then World War II began, and the Nazis invaded. For 5 years, she lived under German occupation, using her passion for dance as an escape, at least for as long as it was safe and possible to do so. I normally don't cover much of an actress' childhood, but for Audrey, this stage of her life affected the professional choices she had to make after the war, the media's portrayal of her in Hollywood, as well as the kind of person she ultimately became. More on that at the end of the video. Robert Mattson's recent book, Dutch Girl, Audrey Hepburn in World War II, details her experiences during this period exhaustively, and I highly recommend it. But to sum it up at the most basic level, it was very, very bad. Severe malnutrition, steady bombing campaigns, family members shot or taken away to labor camps, witnessing the roundup of Jews, witnessing murders and torture. For Audrey to emerge at all was a blessing. To emerge with the vitality we see in her films was a miracle. Her ease and appeal on screen is also surprising, given that prior to Roman Holiday, Audrey barely had any formal acting training whatsoever. At first, it was meant to supplement her income as a chorus girl.
How did you actually become an actress? Who noticed you were from dances?
You were dancing on?
I became a dancer. That's really what I wanted to do always. I never wanted to become an actress, nor did I ever think, in those terms. I became an actress because I had to earn a living, and I started doing little bits in movies, to get the extra buck.
After moving to London shortly after the war, she landed small, nameless roles like hotel receptionist and cigarette girl. But those seemingly thankless opportunities quickly led to more and more substantial supporting roles, like in Secret People, which combined dancing with her increasingly obvious flair for acting. It was clear she had some natural talent, some innate instinct that caught the attention of the right people at the right time. First, there was the French writer, Colette, who spotted Audrey during the filming of Monte Carlo Baby and chose her to play the lead role in her upcoming Broadway play Gigi. Then there was the head of Paramount's London production office, Richard Meland, who had seen Audrey perform and suspected that she might be the right fit for a film the studio was preparing called Roman Holiday. The film's director, William Wyler, wanted an unknown female lead, someone vaguely European, ethereal enough to be a princess, but charismatic enough to carry a romantic comedy. Meland put two and two together and called her in for a screen test. The result has since become somewhat legendary. After completing the scripted portion, the director kept the camera rolling and conducted a short interview with Audrey to get a more natural sense of who she was when she wasn't performing. Her poise came through, even in the face of very personal questions about surviving the war.
I did give performances to collect money for the underground, which always needed money.
And what about the Germans? What did they do about it?
There's to know about it.
The strength of her test sold Wyler and Paramount, both of whom were willing to wait for Audrey to complete her turn in Gigi before filming. The studio did ask if she'd be willing to change her name in order to avoid any accidental associations with Katharine Hepburn, no relation, but she said no. So in the summer of 1952, Audrey Hepburn headed to Rome to begin filming. Roman Holiday follows a young princess from an unnamed European country who feels suffocated and bored by her official duties. One night she manages to escape her guardians and meets a handsome American who, unbeknownst to her, is a journalist who totally knows who she is. They spend a day touring Rome together and deceiving each other by hiding their true identities. Now, Roman Holiday is a very good gateway drug if you're trying to get your friends into classic movies. It holds up really well. Gregory Peck gives his most charming performance, Audrey's comedic timing is top-notch, and although the film predates her iconic partnership with Givenchy, her wardrobe is glorious. I mean, she was in the hands of the great Edith Head, so yeah, it's not a bad alternative. The Hollywood Reporter noted that Miss Hepburn makes her American screen debut a memorable occasion. A beauty, she revels in sensitivity and sincerity in her captivating portrayal of the princess. Needless to say, Paramount knew what they had in Audrey, and so did Gregory Peck, who personally insisted that Audrey receive billing above the film's title. Paramount signed her to a contract for additional films and ramped up publicity to arouse public interest in both Roman Holiday and their newest discovery. To the public and the press, Audrey was something of a curiosity. She was shy, aloof, she didn't love attention. Her origin story had nothing to do with working her way up in the studio system, but rather with the Dutch resistance thwarting Nazis by carrying resistance messages in her shoes. Perhaps most perplexingly, she didn't look like a movie star at all. In the early 1950s, stars like Marilyn Monroe, Ava Gardner, and Elizabeth Taylor defined Hollywood glamour and feminine sensuality. Hourglass figures, larger bust lines, luscious waved hair, dresses cinched at the waist, hugging the hips with low-cut necklines. Audrey brought absolutely none of this to the table. Fashion and fan magazines obsessed over her looks, nitpicking the details that differentiated her from other stars. There was her hair, cropped short, sleeker to the scalp and more ragged around the edges. Her figure, boyish, slender, flat-chested, slim-hipped, and altogether un-Marilyn Monroe-ish. Her face, elfin, nymph-like, gamine. And finally, her style, simpler and more comfortable. One article in Modern Screen mentioned, fashion experts find themselves promoting styles that de-emphasize the bosom and the tight skirt. They're designing clothes that look more pretty than provocative, from the sultry look to the well-scrubbed look, which they say really started with Deborah Carr and Audrey Hepburn. Over time, we've acknowledged Audrey as a fashion icon in her own right, part of a movement that shifted design and beauty standards. Though the press sometimes appeared baffled by her appearance, they couldn't deny that she was also extremely exciting. The public latched on too, inspired by the recent trip of real-life Princess Margaret to America. Roman Holiday performed well at the box office, and soon Oscar nominations rolled in for the film and for Audrey. Leslie Caron also lived under German occupation, except in southern France. A dancer, she too was plucked from relative obscurity and launched to stardom in her first film, 1951's An American in Paris. And with her gamine looks, she helped usher new trends into the mainstream. In 1953, she was nominated for Lily, a story about an orphan who becomes part of a puppeteering act in a carnival. Lily doesn't quite have the flair you might expect from an MGM musical. The head of MGM, Dory Sherry, knew that and even considered shelving the film altogether. Eventually, the studio decided to release it in small theaters and market it as an art house film. It received some rave reviews and developed a committed fan base. Personally, this one not for me, but judge for yourself. It's free online and I'll link it below. The film earned 6 Oscar nominations, winning Best Original Score. Deborah Carr, the Amy Adams of the 1950s, found herself once again nominated for Best Actress, this time for the eventual Best Picture winner From Here to Eternity. Her role as Karen Holmes, the wife of an army officer who has an affair with another soldier on their base, was seen as a departure. She typically played proper, mannered, and, like herself, distinctly British women. But here she was sensual and secretive and even American.
Come back here, Sergeant. I'll tell you the story.
I wasn't cold, she told one paper. The parts were. All Hollywood let me play were pure, sweet, virginal, crystal clear, dull heroines. Because Karen is somewhat of an outlier in her filmography, she's definitely one of Deborah's more interesting roles. But admittedly, she's not in the movie very much, and probably should have been categorized in supporting. Her co-star, Donna Reed, took home that award instead. Maggie Mcnamara made her film debut in 1953's The Moon is Blue, an adaptation of a play in which Maggie also starred, about 2 older playboys pursuing the same young woman. Now, by today's standards, the plot and content of this film are extremely innocent. But in 1953, the Production Code Administration opposed the film's frank approach to sexuality and its scandalous use of words like seduce, pregnant, and virgin. So it denied the film a seal of approval, meaning it was unfit for distribution and could not be shown in theaters. Or so they thought. United Artists defied the ruling and released the picture without changes. It was the first time a major Hollywood studio had done so, and a significant step forward in overcoming censorship in film. Obviously, this was hugely controversial, and some cities banned the film altogether. United Artists leaned into this, branding it as an adult comedy and hoping that the controversy would make people curious and want to see the movie, which, of course, it did. Most people found the film pretty harmless, but also kind of boring. As Bosley Crowther's review in the New York Times put it, Otto Preminger's lifting of the play from the stage to the screen is much too rigidly respectful of its conversational form. As a consequence, the movement is restricted and the talk is exceedingly long. At times it gets awfully tedious, considering its limited range. The film was nominated for 3 Academy Awards, but went home empty-handed. As for Maggie, she didn't love the spotlight either, avoided interviews, and eventually retreated from acting altogether. Ava Gardner also received the only Oscar nomination of her career for her performance in Magumbo. The film, a remake of 1932's Red Dust, also starring Clark Gable, explores the love triangle between a big game hunter, a woman stranded in his home, and another woman on a safari with her boring husband. At the time, Ava was married to Frank Sinatra, who accompanied her to Kenya for filming. The set dynamic was somewhat tumultuous, and partway through filming, Ava discovered that she was pregnant. She flew to London to have an abortion, but in true 1950s fashion, this was reported as dysentery. Gardner, like many other bombshells from this era, was much more popular with general American audiences than she was with the Academy. In 1954, she topped a popularity poll, but wasn't racking up the kinds of wins Audrey was seeing with critics and industry voters. Going into the Oscars, Audrey had won the annual straw poll of Academy voters by the Daily Variety, the annual poll in Film Daily, the New York Film Critics Circle Award, a Golden Globe, and the BAFTA. Needless to say, she was also predicted to win the Oscar, or as one paper put it, she was a hot favorite, a cinch. None of the Best Actress nominees attended the ceremony in LA that year. However, there was kind of a simultaneous East Coast ceremony that year, which Maggie, Deborah, and Audrey all attended.
Here they are. This is the NBC Center Theater in New York. Do you see anyone you recognize?
Audrey was once again in New York City to star on Broadway, this time as an actual nymph in Ondine, for which she won a Tony a few months later. Not a bad year for Miss Hepburn. Her win launched an iconic career, complete with 4 additional Oscar nominations, and as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, a persona that continues to resonate today. But why does it resonate, though? In 2020, audiences crave relatability, which can mean anything from Florence Pugh cooking on Instagram to feeling personal resonance from TV shows that finally see underrepresented groups not as tropes, but as fully formed characters. So it's interesting then that Audrey Hepburn has remained such a popular figure, because she is, by many standards, the least relatable person on the planet. Most of us aren't swathed in tailored designer clothes, we aren't princesses, we aren't going on glamorous European adventures with Cary Grant. Like, look at her posture. Meanwhile, I'm editing this and becoming that scoliosis monster. Audrey, me. Again, Audrey, me. On the other hand, I think that's kind of the point. Audrey Hepburn's films aren't trying to sell us relatability. They represent a fairy tale. Audrey embodies things audiences wish they could be or do or wear. But rarely are those things naturally endowed to her in the script. Instead, her most popular films cast her as a Cinderella figure, from mousy girl in a bookshop to glamorous model in Funny Face, from Cockney flower girl to a refined aristocrat in My Fair Lady, from the chauffeur's daughter to sailing away with a rich man in Sabrina. Though those films endorse a very specific feminine ideal, they don't necessarily feel exploitative or overtly for the male gaze. Though the transformations change her context, she maintains her dignity. And while we see echoes of this formula in films like The Princess Diaries and Miss Congeniality, this kind of film doesn't really exist anymore. Transformations have given way to self-acceptance. We escape into space and into Gotham 800 times, apparently. But if you do want to revel in glamour or aspire to a certain kind of beauty, then why not turn to the woman who did that best? Because that's the thing, she kind of was the best at this kind of film. And it's actually Roman Holiday that best demonstrates why. Princess Anne technically engages in a reverse Cinderella arc, from princess to average woman. But we don't want to be the Audrey gliding in her beautiful gown at a ball. We want to be the Audrey who eats cheap gelato and crams into a tiny car with a few new friends. Like Colette and Meland, who both saw something in Audrey when she was little more than a supporting figure in the background, audiences gravitate to her because she has that indefinable thing that makes stars stars. Freedom, vulnerability, natural elegance. It's not really her wardrobe upgrades that attract people to her stories, so much as it is the charisma Audrey activates when her characters find happiness. As New York Times' Helen Markle Herman wrote of Audrey's performance in Ondine in 1954, her chief asset lies neither in her face nor in her figure. It is to be sought rather in the complete conviction of her playing, of her offbeat freshness, and in the mercurial, elusive charm that somehow puts blinkers on an audience, so that when she's on stage, it becomes virtually impossible to look at anyone else. Audrey Hepburn's filmography is not extensive. She gracefully and slowly transitioned away from acting in the late 1960s, beginning a new phase of her life as a full-time parent and eventually as an advocate for human rights through UNICEF. Celebrity advocacy has a complicated reputation in 2020. Plenty of rich, famous people prioritize photo ops over the greater good. But for a woman who personally experienced war and starvation, who understood the consequences of international relief efforts, to then turn around and spend her life working to ensure that that never happened to another child, this is something different altogether. Starting in the late 80s, she traveled the world, bringing attention to causes such as immunization, hunger, and clean water. Her sincere work for good causes dated back even to the European tour for Sabrina, during which she raised money for Dutch war relief efforts. The cinematic image of Audrey Hepburn is worth discussing, but to me, her goodness and resilience are the most powerful aspects of her story. We could all try to be a little more like Audrey Hepburn, and not just because she looked damn good eating a pastry at Tiffany's, but because she used her platform to make the world better, because she survived and in spite of everything she went through, became someone great. Or, as Rachel Mosley wrote in Trousers and Tiaras, Audrey Hepburn, a woman's star, the story of a little girl who survived for weeks in a cellar during the German occupation of Holland, later to become one of Hollywood's greatest stars, is perhaps the most powerful Cinderella narrative of all.